Wonderful. So first up in our next panel on healthcare is Victoria Cosby, who is a fifth-year doctoral candidate at Queen's University in the History Department in Ontario, Canada, which is near and dear. It's where I first did my first 2 degrees. And she focuses on women, gender, and sexuality in the history of Upper Canada and the Empire. And she'll be speaking on Helping Hands, Harriet Dobbs Cartwright, and healthcare institutions in 19th century Kingston. Over to you.
Hi, I don't have any slides. Sorry about that. Also, it's a quick warning.
Okay.
I have 3 cats who are sleeping right now, but they may wake up and decide to be on camera. I would lock them out of the room, but then they start using their bodies as battering rams to get in. Sorry about that. So Harriet Dobbs was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1808 to Conway Dobbs and Maria Sophia Dobbs. The Dobbs were an upper-class Protestant family in Ireland. She was one of 8 siblings. Her father, Conway, was a barrister, and the family was very financially comfortable. Harriet's mother, Maria, is also the only reason I can write this paper, as she carefully copied and preserved the letters from Harriet into what is now known as the Cartwright Letterbook. This massive tome, over 800 pages of text, is currently stored in the Queen's archives, as are many of the other texts which I have consulted for this paper. As a youth, Harriet received an education that reflected her class and included instruction in literature, language, history, and art, as well as regular lessons on religious devotion. Harriet married in 1832 to Upper Canadian clergyman Reverend Robert David Cartwright. Robert and Harriet were known to each other for a long time, as Robert's sister Mary was married to Harriet's uncle. I know, out of crossing. And it's important to also note that the Cartwright family in Upper Canada was a big deal. They were very wealthy, very well known. Harriet and Robert's journey to Upper Canada after their wedding took about a year, including their honeymoon, as they sailed from Liverpool and landed in New York. Upon arrival in Kingston, Harriet was faced with a place that was so similar and yet so different than Dublin. She noted that the weather was quite familiar, not nearly as bad as people had led her to believe. The amenities were also not as lacking as she thought they would be. There was church and there was society. But Harriet also wrote to her family slightly annoyed that Robert had misled her about his housing situation. Robert had promised her a fully furnished, functional household. What she actually got was a house that didn't even have any plates or spoons. It is also important to remember that in this early period, Harriet identified as a British woman living in the colonies, but this was complicated by her continuing identification and ties with Ireland. She was a member of the upper class and an evangelical Anglican. This separated Harriet completely from some of the other Irish immigrants to Upper Canada, especially the ones in the following years during the famine, who were, by comparison, Catholic and generally underprivileged. Harriet was constantly negotiating these various identities, which influenced and informed how she lived and viewed the poor. One thing that became apparent about Harriet from her letters immediately was her pragmatic nature. She had no interest in wasting time with pleasantries or social conventions, preferring to devote her time to prayer and good works. After the initial shock, it appears that Kingston society accepted that Harriet would not be attending balls or doing a lot of polite visiting. And it was through her volunteering that Harriet really found her place in Canada. Immediately upon her arrival to Upper Canada, Harriet became involved in various voluntary communities in Kingston. Her husband, Robert, the minister, was already involved in benevolent work on Wednesdays, teaching young people reading, writing, and lessons in morality. Harriet accompanied him most of the time, and only a few months after her arrival, she was already organizing a separate group for young ladies to study scripture together. This also served as a much-needed social group for the young women of Kingston's upper class. She also started a women's sewing group, which sold their wares and donated the proceeds to support the poor of the community. All of these commitments took Harriet away from her home and family for large periods of the day. In 1834, Harriet wrote to her closest friend, "The apprehensions that seem to have arisen at home, that I may be doing too much and neglecting home duties. I do not wish to be misunderstood. But I know that both by myself and by others, much time is squandered on frivolous and vain pursuits, or in shapeless idleness, that may well be redeemed for more useful occupations." This quote is a demonstration of how Harriet viewed volunteering, religion, and home duties. Her devotion to the evangelical religious movement took her away from the home and family, which she found significantly less interesting than her pursuits in the community. Luckily for Harriet, she had her sisters-in-law Mary and Sarah, who took on most of the household and child rearing, so she could be involved out in the community. This was a type of socially accepted rebellion. She frequently used her devotion to the Lord to escape her domestic and social obligations. Not to say that her religious devotion was fake, it just also suited her own pursuits and passions in life. One of the most lasting effects of Harriet's volunteering is the foundation of the Kingston General Hospital. I'd also like to note that so many other women were central to this, and their labor should be in no way diminished. Because of that, I would like to take a minute to rewind and provide some background information about the hospital before Harriet's arrival in Upper Canada. I would also like to acknowledge my debt to Dr. Margaret Angus, a former archivist at Queen's, whose work on the history of Kingston General Hospital has been invaluable in my work. The quest for a local hospital begins in 1817, when the Kingston Compassionate Society was established to provide aid privately to the immigrant sick and poor, as there were no poor laws in Upper Canada at this time. Middle and upper class women who had free time were not permitted to work for monetary gain in the public sphere, but they were allowed to work for free if it was good works. Women's charitable activities were widespread in the 19th century. It was one of the ways women could subvert the gendered expectations of propriety. The Kingston Compassionate Society was loosely based on the Montreal Ladies' Benevolent Society, which was already running a house of recovery at this time. Within a few months, the Kingston Compassionate Society was already overwhelmed by the amount of people needing aid, and they quickly recognized that it was not just immigrants who were sick, but many Kingston residents as well. In 1818, the magistrates granted them several lots of land for building a hospital. But a year later, the government discontinued providing funds for aiding the poor altogether, which once again put the onus on private groups. The Kingston Compassionate Society, undeterred, opened a single room as a temporary hospital which operated seasonally. In early 1821, the Kingston Compassionate Society was reformed into the Female Benevolent Society, whose mandate was to visit the sick, poor, inquire about their circumstances, administer necessary relief, and endeavor to stir them up into industry, method, neatness, and economy. So the purpose of this new organization went far beyond just healing the physical body. It was concerned with total self-improvement and reformation of character. Morality and health went hand in hand. The women of the Female Benevolent Society were responsible for founding, funding, and running the hospital in Kingston for more than 20 years. Over the years, the physical location changed from an old blockhouse to an empty brewery warehouse to an actual physical building that was built with the intention of being a hospital. So it came from humble roots. At first, the hospital operated seasonally and relied on retired and half-pay military surgeons who donated their time and their expertise free of charge. In 1827, the women of the Female Benevolent Society were running out of funds as donations from the community had kind of dried up at this point. They were forced to restrict the number of people admitted to the hospital. By 1829, some of the prominent men of Kingston applied for a government grant on behalf of the Female Benevolent Society because women were not permitted to petition themselves. And in 1831, there was an agreement in a public meeting that the public hospital was a necessity for the community. The Female Benevolent Society eventually petitioned the legislature for funds, and it also collected subscriptions from the Kingston community to provide additional support. And in January 1832, the Assembly ordered them £3,000 to aid in the building of the hospital. Great victory. Except the cholera epidemic that summer halted any progress as the city scrambled to deal with the immediate emergency. This is when Harriet arrived in Upper Canada and became involved. The Female Benevolent Society had already been operating the hospital, as I mentioned, for a while, and she was quite impressed by the upper-class women running the institution. In 1835, Kingston had finally built its hospital. But that same year, the hospital burnt down in a massive fire that destroyed a significant part of the city. This fire, where one person in the hospital actually died, also took with it all of the Female Benevolent Society's materials, supplies, and their funds. Harriet was involved in the revitalization project that followed, particularly with fundraising and organizational management. She was also one of the visitors who actually went out to meet the poor families to learn about their housing, finances, and most importantly, their religious affiliations. Though the hospital was open to all denominations, there was a heavy favoring of Protestants. Now, it is important to remember again that Harriet's identity as an upper-class Anglican Irish woman definitely had an influence on how she viewed poverty and illness. She was pretty bigoted against Catholicism and associated it with poverty and lower classes. In one of her letters, she refers to these people as being half barbarous in appearance and manner, which indicates her low opinion of the people she was serving at the hospital. She was probably not the only one with this opinion in the Female Benevolent Society, as it was run by women of similar class standing. In late 1830s, Harriet also explained in her letters home to Ireland how they planned on funding, and rebuilding the hospital. Instead of collecting funds from the community, the Female Benevolent Society managed to take the issue to the legislature once again, which voted to and agreed to pay for the rent of the hospital under the care of the women of the society. Harriet herself took on the role of secretary of the hospital, which was a continuation of her management and visitation role, which she had begun many years earlier. Finally, in 1845, the Kingston General Hospital was officially opened as a charity hospital. This was an amazing feat, largely thanks to the women of the Female Benevolent Society, who tirelessly appealed for government aid. The same year, the Sisters of the Hotel Dieu opened the Hotel Dieu Hospital, which was a Catholic charity hospital only a few blocks away from the Protestant-run Kingston General Hospital. So it's important to remember that there's this whole other group of charity-driven women operating in the small space of Kingston at this time who were devoted to taking care of the sick and poor, the only division being religious. The general management of the Kingston General Hospital was in the hands of the directress of the Female Benevolent Society, and the day-to-day work was done by various volunteer visitors. Harriet was listed as the #1 visitor of the hospital at this time. The women of the Female Benevolent Society continued to run the hospital full-time for several years. This was increasingly difficult during the typhus epidemic of 1847, when waves and waves of deathly ill immigrants, particularly from Ireland, arrived on Kingston's shores. It is important to note that throughout this entire decades of time that it took to establish the hospital, it was women who were primarily responding to the needs of the poor and sick during healthcare emergencies. Officially in 1849, only 4 years after the hospital opened, the Female Benevolent Society stepped down from the daily affairs of the hospital, and an official committee of men were appointed to take their place. Once the state took over running the hospital, the efforts of these women were largely obscured and overlooked. If you look at the Kingston General Hospital website today, you will see a brief mention of the Female Benevolent Society's role in the history of the hospital. But this is just a cursory nod to it does not do justice to the amount of labor and lobbying that occurred to make the hospital happen. Thank you.
Wonderful.